invite the honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is the first time I've been able to rise and debate in the House of Commons in the 44th Parliament, and I'd like to begin by thanking a few people. Throughout my career, I've been a public servant, and I'm honoured to once again be serving the good people of Kootenay, Columbia. The past 20 months have been a difficult time. Many have answered the call to assist fellow Canadians, done so quietly without acknowledgement. So today I want to acknowledge one of those groups. My sincere gratitude to the constituency and Hill staff employees who have worked tirelessly under difficult circumstances to diligently support every member of this House and the constituents we serve. Madam Speaker, there is no elected path to this House, this chamber, that doesn't involve tremendous support of family, and today I would like to take a moment to thank my wife Heather for her commitment to our family and democracy, for her unwavering support for the work I do here on behalf of Kootenay Columbians and indeed all Canadians. Pursuant to the greater good and always with a sacrifice, I am so proud to be the beneficiary of her love and support. Madam Speaker, today we'll be talking about the mandatory minimum sentences as part of the C-5 discussion, and I'd like to begin by setting the record straight. Colleagues across the aisle have once again taken serious legislation and are using it as a tool for political division. They have created a nice narrative for themselves, suggesting they are hard at work undoing the Conservative MMPs, when in fact the majority of the mandatory minimum penalties that C-5 stands to eliminate are applicable to firearm offences that were actually introduced by the previous Liberal governments. For those listening at home, Bill C-5, presented by this government, includes the removal of mandatory minimum penalties for criminals who commit firearm offences, including but not limited to using a firearm in the commission of offences, weapons trafficking, and robbery with a firearm. This government would rather send criminals who commit these offences home. Madam Speaker, Bill C-5 hits close to home, both personally and, of course, professionally, as I served on the front lines of the war on drugs and have dealt with violent offenders throughout my career. What I know to be the absolute truth is it's difficult to come up with solutions to big problems like the one we're addressing today without hearing from the victims. I've been in a room with parents who've lost a child to an overdose and have investigated and arrested the most violent criminals. I have first-hand experience with front line of these issues and have seen a clear and widening gap between where this bill currently sits and where we need to go in order to make change. While we come to this House from different perspectives, I do believe everyone in this chamber has a desire to do right by Canadians. So, Madam Speaker, let me be clear to my colleagues across the aisle. If they want change, this bill won't get them there. In fact, based on my first-hand experience, C-5 will move us further away from where we need to be on our collective pursuit of safer communities. Canadians need to know, and I want to be crystal clear on what the Conservative position is, convicted violent predators, those individuals who prey on the innocence of our daughters and sons, deserve to go to prison, not the comforts of their home. And yet this government seems politically determined at the cost of safe communities to send these criminals on a backyard vacation. Madam Speaker, through Bill C-5, the government also seeks to eliminate 6 mandatory minimums in the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act that target drug dealers. This includes trafficking or possession for the purpose of trafficking, importing or exporting or possession for the purpose of exporting, production of heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, crystal meth. The government's own messaging leads Canadians to believe they are simply helping those who struggle with addiction. The minister fails to point out that mandatory minimums being eliminated are in place for those who targeted criminals who prey on addictions. There are far too many Canadians struggling with addiction. Instead of being focused on removing and reducing consequences for criminals, Bill C-5 should instead be focused on offering help those that so desperately need it who are suffering from addictions. My Conservative colleagues and I believe strongly that those struggling with addictions should be the priority and receive the help that's needed. We have an opioid epidemic across this country, and in British Columbia, the situation is pronounced. Far too many parents and loved ones are receiving that dreaded phone call where they're left to process the brutal reality that their child has suffered an overdose. If I may, Madam Speaker, I'd like to take a moment to address the issues of drug use and recovery. The road to recovery, which I have both professional and personal experience, is very difficult and long-term commitment. Successful crime prevention starts with our youth and must continue throughout their lives. Education programs can be successful if delivered at the appropriate time. However, Addiction to opioids, for example, the effort and success takes years. We do know that the present system is not successful and it does require change. But we need an approach that's a positive solution to rehabilitation, one that is configured to help those who are addicted instead of those who are profiting from addiction. Madam Speaker, given the decline in mental health and its connectivity to the issue we are talking about today, I would like to take this opportunity to join my colleagues in calling on the government to commit to an implementation date of funding the national 3-digit helpline in this House, unanimously passed in the 43rd Parliament. The government owes it to Canadians to activate the line that creates meaningful legislation that will actually serve to make our communities safe. We asked yesterday for a date for the 988 to be activated. There was no response. Contrary to what the minister claims, this is not about reducing mandatory minimum penalties, MMPs, for simple possession. Mandatory minimums for simple possession don't exist. Madam Speaker, Bill C-5 does nothing to address that. Instead, it eliminates mandatory prison time for drug traffickers who commit acts of violence. It allows criminal of violent acts to serve their sentences on house arrest rather than in prison. Puts our communities at risk. I'd really like to know who the government consulted. Did they talk to the victims? Organized crime and gangs prey on our youth. A friend of mine had a 12-year-old daughter who was approached in an elementary playground by a gang member who tricked this girl into using crystal meth. By the time the girl was 13, she had stolen most of her family valuables to support her addiction. The organized crime gang forced her into prostitution. To consider reducing minimum sentences for these gang members is not a solution. Madam Speaker, the minister says the purpose of the bill is to tackle overrepresentation of Indigenous people and Black Canadians in our prisons. According to a recent article from the Globe and Mail, the bill doesn't meet that objective. The article states that the bill is, if it's about racial justice, every single provision in the bill is entirely race neutral. For nearly a year, the government has asserted that the selected mandatory minimum penalties disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous people, but have offered no evidence to suggest they will meaningfully redress overrepresentation. Bill C-5 leaves in place the harshest mandatory minimum penalties and their brutal effects for Indigenous women in particular. According to the 2019 Corrections and Conditional Release Statistical Overview, a report released by the Minister of Public Safety, almost half the women sentenced to mandatory life sentences are Indigenous, and most acted in self-defense context of lifetimes of abuse and trauma. Madam Speaker, clearly these women are victims and not the greatest risk to public safety in Canada. Yet Bill C-5 will continue to serve Canada's harshest penalties. All Canadians deserve a more fair and just criminal legal system. Nanaimo, BC has a very successful restorative justice program. This is where we need to focus for a path forward. We're left to wonder who the government consulted on this legislation and whether or not those voices are present in this bill's current form. I'm also left to wonder about their understanding and the enforcement of this bill as to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, a set of principles that peace officers and prosecutors should use for determining whether to lay charges for possession. Surely the minister knew that police officers already have that flexibility to do this. Conservatives have a serious concerns with the government proposal to allow criminals to serve house arrest rather than jail time for a number of offenses, including sexual assault, human trafficking, kidnapping. This bill puts community victims at risk. In closing, Madam Speaker, I would like to ask all the colleagues in this House to consider real-life outcome that they will be enacting by choosing to make life easier for violent offenders and drug traffickers. It seems apparent we should instead be holding these criminals accountable for their actions and focus instead on creating meaningful legislation that will help our victims and those with addictions to make safer communities for which we live. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague on his re-election. I just want to pick up on a couple of his comments, especially with respect to evidence of disproportionate impact of MMPs on racialized communities, particularly Indigenous and Black communities. There's overwhelming social science research. There are a number of court cases that have indicated that this does have a disproportionate impact. And also, when I was part of developing the National Anti-Racism Strategy in 2019, we heard from so many different communities across Canada on this. I'm just wondering where he is picking up the evidence with respect to that there's no impact of removing MMPs on these particular offenses that he cited in the Globe and Mail, because the overwhelming evidence is that there is a disproportionate impact because of MMPs to racialized communities.
Honourable Member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the honourable member for the question. That's not exactly what I said. But just to clarify, the Globe and Mail was a comment in the Globe and Mail. I do believe I'm an evidence-based individual, and I believe in following the evidence as to where we move forward. And show me the evidence and how we can actually, this bill will actually help those people who are marginalized right now.
Questions and comments. Honorable Député de Beauport.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Madam Speaker. A very long time ago, a man named Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. And essentially, in this book, he argues that crime can be maintained by a society's customs. So, today I'm wondering, in some cases, is our society perhaps maintaining crime through a lack of funding, support, and resources to social services? Because some of these young people, if they were better supported, would be able to get out of crime rather than being inflicted with long sentences.
Madam Speaker, and thank the member for the question. And yes, absolutely, we do need to help our youth out. And for example, the opioid crisis, which is a great example, if we were to have a program that could help them and get them on the right track, a rehabilitation program, that got them through this so that they were in fact being helped rather than continuing in the criminal justice system, that would be a huge bonus.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay, Albany.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his important interventions and talking about the opioid and overdose crisis. Madam Speaker, Chief James Raymer from the Toronto Police Department wrote in a letter to Dr. Davila, the Toronto's medical health officer, that the force supports a new approach to decriminalization. He said, quote, "We agree that the current approach to managing drug use does not support safe communities or advance the health of people who use drugs." He cited that decriminalization of the simple possession of all drugs, combined with the scale-up of prevention, harm reduction, and treatment services, is a more effective way to address public health and public safety harms associated with substance abuse. He said that a decriminalization model should include a safe supply of drugs, something healthcare workers have demanded for years. Madam Speaker, through you, does my colleague support the Police Chiefs Association, medical health officers across this country, and experts in their call to action to end the poison drug supply crisis and save lives?
Honourable Member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his question. And having been a former member of the Chiefs Association, Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, I'm very familiar with where they're going, and I do agree that right now we are in a decriminalization of most drugs because the courts cannot handle that anyways. So that is a discretion of the members, and that's where they're working right now. I do believe that we need to do a lot of work to support those people with addictions, and that criminal prosecution is not the answer in many cases, especially for those who are addicted to the opioids, for example. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the